Thank you, Dan. Pleasure to be with everybody. I did 7 terms in the U.S. House and 4 terms in the State House, 2 in the Senate. And people ask, why did I leave? I said, 13 elections, 13-0, undefeated and unindicted so far. So the latter being more important than the former. Okay. So having said that, we're really excited to have the speaker here with us and Sylvia and Kathleen to talk about health care. We want to kind of take a look behind the scenes, what really happened. What were the compromises? What were the difficult decisions that had to be made? Kind of like a peek behind the curtain, if you will. For me, it's kind of hard to imagine. You think back 15 years. I was elected in 2004. I remember in 2002 standing next to George W. Bush and Dick Cheney in Allentown, Pennsylvania, in my district when I was in the state Senate, where they announced their Medicare Modernization Act, Medicare Part D. That was, they created the program. And then 7 years later came the Affordable Care Act. And it's hard to think about life before those 2 laws. The Affordable Care Act, took care of people with pre-existing conditions, provided a lot of coverage for people who didn't have it. Part D, now seniors don't have to worry about getting their drugs. So the world's changed. So let's get right to it and talk about all these big issues. And I thought we'd start with the speaker, maybe just to, tell us, you were in Congress when Bill Clinton was president, and you were there when that attempt at health care failed. And then several years later, here you are, and you lead a successful effort to enact the ACA. Why did that fail? And why do you think that you were successful?
Well, let's be positive as we go into the future. First of all, thank you for your leadership in the Congress. It was wonderful to serve with the Congress. It's an honor to be here with not 1 but 2 secretaries of HHS. And thank you, Don. Do I call you Mr. President? Thank you for inviting us here. Okay, so here's the thing. I don't like to use the word fail. It was an attempt. For over 100 years, presidents had been trying to pass health care, something to provide health care for all Americans. The Clintons had an attempt, and it may have not succeeded in terms of passing the bill, but it certainly succeeded in raising the awareness and making it possible for us to pass a bill later. So I just give them credit for that. Having said that, as a member of Congress, we made it clear to our great president, who was inspirational, aspirational, and everything, Barack Obama, that we could only pass the bill with his committed leadership, and that was definite. But we were legislators, and we were going to write the bill. And that was a big difference between what happened in the Clinton years and now. That was a bill written in the White House. Ours was written by the legislators who had to vote on the bill. And that was a big distinction.
We have a pretty sophisticated healthcare audience here. And I think a lot of people may have forgotten, and of course none of you did, but that the ACA is really 2 bills that became law.
Yeah.
Can you kind of help remind us why that happened after Ted Kennedy passed away and then that changed the dynamics in the Senate?
Okay, so this is tough, okay? But that's what it is if you want to succeed. What happened was the Senate passed a bill that was, they will have their own view, totally unacceptable to the House members.
My view, too.
That never happens.
To the House members. And basically, my members said, don't ask me to vote for that, I won't vote for it. I said, I'm not asking you to vote for it. I'm not even going to vote for it. So it was totally unacceptable. It was, look, let me just put this in perspective. For 100 years, they've been trying to pass a bill. This was a challenge of our generation to do something very special for the American people that made a difference in their lives. So so there we were, which was, this has to be the right bill. This is not something where we're going to have an opportunity cost because we went for the lowest common denominator. We were going to do what we set out to do. So how it turned into 2, well, actually it was another piece. We had the education bill, too, was another part of the bill, but that's a different, we'll just stay with health here. I said to them, I'll tell you what's wrong with your bill. I will make a list of things that have to be in the final product. The way reconciliation works, and it's not, more than going into that detail. They passed their bill with the promise that they would pass, we would pass theirs. I said to the members, this was a tough thing, because I said to the members, you don't have to vote for this. Now you do, because, because we're going to get our list of amendments to it. How do I convince my members to trust that that will happen in the Senate when they've sent to this totally unacceptable bill? So Harry Reid, he was the giant, he was the hero in all of this. Harry Reid, I said, Harry, here are the concerns. I need a pledge from you that this will pass. He brought me a letter, dear Speaker, signed by 50 members of Congress. 51, we did a separate letter because he wasn't in town. That was Senator, well, never mind, but so Harry brings this letter signed by all of those senators that they will vote for that list. You remember this very well. But that was so great because that's a hard thing to do. And I said, Harry, don't give it to me. I've seen it. I trust you. And I'm just going to tell the members that this is guaranteed by you. Harry, we passed that bill, as you know. The way the rules work in the Senate, you can't, it's goofy, but you can't amend the bill until it's passed. So we had to pass it. They passed it, we passed it, then they passed our amendments, and then we passed that, and it was signed by the president. But it was all because there were different views of how this was. Now, just to back up for a moment, and then we're going to hear from our secretaries. When you mentioned that Senator Kennedy passed away, we had the votes for, the 60 votes. Then Senator Kennedy passed away. It was so sad for all of us for a lot of reasons. But then the press said to me, you're out of it. You're done. You ain't got no 60 votes anymore. And I said, what I said to you before, this is a challenge to our generation. We are not letting anything stand in our way. If something is, a fence is there, we will break through the gate. If that doesn't work, we'll climb the fence. If that doesn't work, we'll pole vault in. If that doesn't work, we'll parachute in. But we're not letting anything stand in the way of passing the bill that we have in mind to meet the needs of the American people. So after all was said and done, they said, which one did you do? And I said, we did the first one. We walked through the gates because we had the courage of our members to stick with the program, the outside mobilization. And understand this, in passing legislation, outside mobilization is so important. President Lincoln said outside sentiment is so important. With it, you can do almost anything. Without it, practically nothing. But for sentiment to prevail, people have to know. So we had to let them know what was in it for them and what was at stake. So we had public sentiment of the patient group, advocacy groups. We had every aspect. The doctors, most of the hospitals, the Catholic hospitals, not the bishops, the Catholic hospitals, and we had the nuns. Very important, right, Kathleen?
We absolutely.
We had the nuns, but the nuns were there pushing. And so while we didn't have the bishops, we had the nuns.
Much more important.
And we pushed open that gate, and we did it with public sentiment, outside mobilization, in addition to our inside maneuvering to get it done.
Okay. I'm going to throw this question to Kathleen and to the speaker. About what were the biggest compromises, maybe one or two, maybe three biggest compromises that you felt you had to make in order to get this health care law enacted, not just in the House, but across the board? Kathleen, you want to start there?
Sure. First, I just want to go back and emphasize a couple of things. The speaker has already said, when Barack Obama announced for president in January of 2007, he said, I'm going to pass a health care bill my first term. He made that commitment. And so he was in from the get-go, but knew that the bill needed to have legislative ownership. But I can guarantee you, if Nancy Pelosi was not speaker, there would never have been an Affordable Care Act. Period. Full stop. Never. Never, never, never. And as she said, she not only had to take it through the House once, but then she had to come back and take the Senate bill back through the House and say, remember when we didn't like it? Well, now we like it. And now we, and it just would have never happened. I would say, Charlie, to your question about compromises, there were some things along the way that we were very hopeful that we could get Republicans to come on board in either the House or the Senate. This bill ended up being passed with not a single Republican vote. But we kept adding amendments, thinking it will bring people, if you make an amendment in committee and we add your amendment, then surely you will vote for the bill. Wrong. One of the big compromises losses was really losing the public option. That's right. And that was Joe Lieberman. That was Senator Lieberman, who surprised everybody by announcing on Meet the Press that he was not going to vote for a public option, and no one had known that before he told Tim Russert. That was a huge loss because that would have been a great way to moderate costs in the marketplace. There were some other compromises, I think, that had to be made based on trying to reach a budget number that would work. And so, there were glitches in how many members of the family could come in, things like that, that were changed, not because people thought they were great policy, but because they were trying to reach a budget number. And it, frankly, at many points, it was about what the Senate would not vote for, as opposed to what the House would or would not accept. So there were some things that had, we believed that because states regulated the insurance markets, that if we wrote the bill in a way that allowed states to step up and have their own marketplaces, they would do that. What we didn't anticipate is 13 attorneys general filed a lawsuit the day the president signed the bill, suing about the constitutionality and taking their participation in the marketplace off the table. By the time we got to the Supreme Court, that number had grown to 26 Republican attorneys general were suing, so state-based participation was not great. People kept accusing us of the feds are taking over healthcare. Frankly, it would be a whole lot better off if we had taken over healthcare and just done it. But so I would say the compromises often were among ourselves to try and make the bill more palatable, bring in a bipartisan group. Failing that at the end, I think if we could have gone back and rewritten it, it would look pretty different. It would be Nancy Pelosi's bill.
Speaker, what compromises, what do you think?
Didn't have too much in the compromise department because we couldn't get the public option, and that would have saved money. And Madam Secretary said it very well. So it wasn't a compromise. We just didn't get it, and that was a disappointment. However, there are two things that Madam Secretary was instrumental in ensuring that the bill would pass, and I want to call those to your attention. One was the language that related to women's reproductive health. This bill had nothing to do with terminating a pregnancy. That isn't allowed with federal dollars. It had nothing to do with that. What the bishops and some others were presenting that out there as if, it has abortion in the bill. It didn't. It didn't. They said to me, they're about practicing Catholic, who's since been excommunicated for my activities here, but they said to me, I've never seen the bishops so united as they are united against the Affordable Care Act. And I was like, I didn't even read it because it has nothing in there. But the Madam Secretary developed an executive order that the president put forth that was a comfort to some people who may have had that concern. Did you want to speak to that, Kathleen?
Well, as you said, it did not have any language in it that we were even correcting. So issuing an order that we would not have federal funding dealing with abortion coverage was a relatively easy promise to make because it was against the law, and at least when I served in the cabinet, we believed in the law and we kind of followed that. So pretty good promise to make, but it did give some people a bit of comfort. And as the speaker already alluded to, one of the, many of you may not know, but Speaker Pelosi and I are alums of the same Catholic Women's College in Washington. We were there at a slightly different time, but we're actually Trinity sisters, and we both are educated by nuns. And what we both knew is that if you can get the nuns on board, the bishops can do whatever they want. But these are the people who do the work, who run the healthcare, who teach in the schools, and every Catholic legislator, basically, nobody was taught by a bishop. They all were taught by nuns. So we had the nuns across the country who signed a letter. I mean, think about this. These are the heads of every major novitiate in the country. The bishops have already come out with a letter saying to Catholic lawmakers, do not ever vote for this bill. And the nuns stood up and said, you listen to me, Johnny. This is about health care. This is about keeping people well. And thousands of women stepped up and were standing behind this legislation. And it made a huge difference. It made a huge difference across the country.
Because some of our members have been in the priesthood, not becoming priests, but early stages of seminary, and they were all for the bill because they read it and they knew what was in it. But some of the others didn't, and they had to do what the bishop said. Oh, really? But then they didn't. I just want to say, when the day of the bill signing, Congressman, we went to President Obama and said, we want you to take a picture with the Trinity sisters. And he said, as we do that, he said, of course, we're the nuns. And we said, no, we're the Trinity sisters. Of course, Kathleen was there much after me. Now, one other thing, and this is Kathleen again, Madam Secretary again, this was the biggest obstacle in my view. That was a sort of something we had to deal with. But the biggest obstacle was regional disparities. Our members were from all over the country, as you know, and they saw things differently. Our goal in the bill was to have value, not volume, so that communities where they were just treating people, sending them home, and then they come right back in because they had to be readmitted because they were not appropriately cared for. They were making a lot of money, but if you had value and people would go home equipped and the rest, then you weren't making so much money. So the people around the country who were like, why should our people be paying for what's happening in, say, for example, Florida, for one, just for one. And so anyway, that was a big problem until about 3 o'clock in the morning, Friday night. Now we're bringing the bill to the floor on Sunday. Friday night, we're still working this out. And again, Madam Secretary, to the rescue. Do you want to say what you did there? What you did was, you you did
we
the letter.
committed to do basically a cost-based study by region, and the problem was that if you drew the baseline at the low region states, they would really be penalized for the efficiency of delivering health care, and that's what they really didn't want. And they were worried that somehow they'd be lumped in and would actually be financially penalized for the work they did, and they wanted additional funding so that they could do more preventive work, they could do more patient-centered work, they could, do more casework. So we actually worked out a HHS commitment that would be the way we would organize the financial base work of the bill. But again, I was called to the rescue because you knew those 6 or 8 members were not going to sign on unless they got a commitment, and so it was amazing to watch the speaker work on passage, knowing, this is a big, very diverse caucus, each of whom had their pet peeves, and she knew every single person what their needs were, what they wanted, what their children's names are, where they lived. And what we did is work with them to fashion a bill that suited the needs and moved healthcare forward.
Now, before I turn to Sylvia, can I ask both of you real quickly, were you always confident that this bill was going to become law?
You talking to me?
Yeah, both of you, because you were there for the... or you
Never
have
had
your
one
doubts?
doubt for 1 second. Never. No, I always knew that we would pass the bill that we needed to pass. Not some Senate version. The bill that we needed to pass. And it was just a question of, see, here's the thing, just remember this when you're a speaker or something, don't bring up the bill until you have the votes. So we're like, well, we keep doing this until we have the votes. So when we had the votes, we brought it up. A couple years later, the Republicans, they said, we're going to defeat the Affordable Care Act on the anniversary of the day it was brought up. And I said to my colleagues, don't even worry about it. They picked a date that has nothing to do with their capability. You know, it's about when we pass the bill, not when they could pass the bill. So you have to bring it up when you're ready. And I knew we would be ready. Our 100 years, the president was fabulous. This was a president who would talk to us about the particulars in the bill, excuse himself, go be on the phone about aid to Haiti or something like that with heads of state from around the world, come right back into chapter and verse in the bill. This was something really important. Some of the people on the staff, not so much, but...
On his staff.
His staff. Yeah, his staff. Yeah, they wanted to shrink it. I said, what are you talking about? We're not doing an eensy-peensy bill. We're doing the bill that we have to do. So no, I never had one doubt because I knew that we would achieve our goal.
By the way, keep taking those little shots at the Senate. I mean,
Yeah,
I think it's, every day's the same over there. They start slowly, then they wind down from there. 2 speeds, slow and glacial. That's the Senate. Okay. Kathleen, do you have any doubts?
I really didn't, because I think the two most important people were the President of the United States and the Speaker of the House, and they were not going to give up. There was no, and President Obama would say frequently, just tell me, is there any way to get there? Is there any, and people would say, yes, you can, jump over, parachute in, do whatever, but I mean, there was always a threat, and he was fine. There were people who were saying just, ensure 3 children and 2 adults and call it a day and move on to another topic, and he was not about to do that.
It was great.
Well, let me turn to the 2 secretaries.
But I did praise Harry Reid.
Yes, you
Yes.
did. Yes, you did.
Yes,
That's
indeed.
one.
May he rest in peace. And to the 2 secretaries. Let's talk a little bit about the challenges of executing and implementing the law. And Kathleen and I were talking about, Sylvia and I were talking today at lunch, about some of the challenges to the law. In 2013, there was a defund Obamacare movement. I can tell you stories about that. And then there was the 2017, the repeal replace movement. And now here you are today dealing with the reconciliation, Medicaid changes. But why don't you guys give us a sense from the executive branch how difficult this was? And Sylvia, why don't we start with you?
So I think that in terms of the implementation, there were a couple things that made the implementation difficult. And focusing on the fact that the setting up the marketplace and doing that, the marketplace is actually, it's a private sector function in a sense. And I think people were confused about what that was. And it was, you were using technology. And think about Amazon having to check your citizenship status, having to check to see if your income is what you said it was. I mean, the complexity of what was being set up, I think, wasn't understood. And it was all in service of private insurers that were going to be providing this. The second part that was really complicated that I think people underestimated that was a part, but it's part of why it worked, was you were actually reshaping the market. So remember, before this happened, and this is why, and I do have to, let me just pause 1 second and say, the speaker, I've been fortunate, worked 8 years in the Clinton administration. I've worked with Newt Gingrich. I've worked with Robert Byrd. I've worked with Trent Lott. I've been in the room and been with all of those leaders. We are, as Kathleen said, this was an important reason. This speaker, she knows the substance, always. She understands the politics always. She will never stray from the core that this is about the American people. And there is nobody that can manage their caucus like this speaker.
And she can count votes. And she can count.
I had this conversation
count.
about the counting, and that was what I had said, that there were some mistakes that they had made. But so this implementation issue, these were very complicated issues. You were creating a new market. You were asking private insurers to do something they'd never done. What they did was, before the Affordable Care Act, I try and find the healthy people. I try and get a pool of healthy people. And the way the law worked, you could do that. The Affordable Care Act said, you can't cut out people with pre-existing conditions. And if I asked everybody in this room to raise their hand and say, do you or anyone in your family have a pre-ex? I'm not sure there would be anybody in the room that did not raise their hand. And so once you brought those people into the pool, you created a very different thing. Unfortunately, we had a secretary as we were starting and as we were making this who was an insurance commissioner as well as a governor in terms of it. So those were elements about implementation were hard. One of the other things that I would say was very hard about the implementation was the fending off. And when I say the fending off, you were trying to protect. And so there were over 115 investigations of the Affordable Care Act shared between the two of us. Mm-hmm. There were over 70 votes to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Mm-hmm. And that does not even get to the number of court cases. Mm-hmm. Hobby Lobby versus Burwell, King versus Burwell, how many versus Sebelius? And so that was a big part of what created real difficulty in implementation. Because when you're fighting on this front, your ability to move forward and implement all the parts of a very big, complicated bill, it was difficult.
Well, I agree with everything Sylvia said. So, you know, the day the president signs the bill, March of 2010, he gets sued by attorneys general who begin this absolute diehard partisan fight. I mean, it was, we're not going to participate at the state level. We don't want your bill. We don't. The election in 2010, unfortunately, the Democrats lost control of the House and lost 6 seats in the Senate, had control by just a few votes. And that, again, enhanced the partisanship of what was going on. The Congress never passed any implementation money, refused to cooperate on putting any money forward to try and set this massive system in place. Rules and regs became incredibly complicated, and as Sylvia said, investigations and hearings, and we had a small Supreme Court case that was pending and finally decided in June of 2012, and then a re-election in June of 2012, where the opponent, Mitt Romney, had pledged that he would repeal the Affordable Care Act, even though it was based on the law that he had passed in Massachusetts. So, I mean, it was a fight on various fronts. It really, I think Fox News gave it juice day in and day out. I was accused of running death panels. I was going to pick and choose who died. Everybody was going to lose their doctor. They were going to lose their firstborn child. And all we could do, because the full implementation was not going to be until January of 2014. So the bill is signed in 2010. We had 3.5 years of the he said, she said, with the wildest accusations and hearings and fights and no money. Congress passed measures, you probably remember, Congressman passed measures that said the secretary can't even transfer. We couldn't use HHS money from one department to another. They tried every way, shape, or form to make sure that the bill could not be implemented. And then in October of 2013, when Ted Cruz, reading Green Eggs and Ham, shuts the government down over the possible start of the the website crashed. So we had like the perfect storm of I think if the Senate ever knew that the website was going to crash, they wouldn't have to shut the government down because you couldn't enroll anyway. We managed to fix that. But what people have told me, and the Speaker is a much better historian, certainly of Congress, than I am, but that never had a major piece of legislation been passed that after it was passed and signed into law that didn't bring about bipartisan cooperation and support. And Charlie mentioned the
Medicare Part D.
Yeah, Medicare Part D that was passed during the Bush administration. While Democrats and
Opposed
Republicans battled over that bill, as soon as it was passed, everybody was on board, implemented it, governors came on board. That was never the case with the Affordable Care Act. So it was an absolute pitched battle from start to finish.
Well, you brought up the 2013 government shutdown, which occurred October 1, 2013.
I do remember.
And I remember the summer,
was
July,
at
I went to then Majority Leader Eric Cantor and said, hey, this new guy from Texas, the junior senator, wants to defund Obamacare of ACA. This is like a really dumb idea because even if it worked, it would still fail. It's a monumentally stupid thing to do. And it's an act of political self-sabotage. And he said, you're absolutely right. We're going to go meet with 6 Republican senators and talk about this time. This was in July. And so met with what I call Team Normal. And everybody said, yeah, this is a really dumb idea. Then, of course, we run right into September. And then, we're going over the cliff. And I just remember having some really uncomfortable conversations with then the whip, who later became the Speaker, about why this was dumb, and I was not going to vote for a rule to bring up the bill, which I didn't. He said, we have to do a clean bill, otherwise this is going to shut down, and we're going to look like idiots because this is our fault. We're making a policy demand, and even if the Senate passed it, defund it, and then Obama signed it, how do you defund a mandatory program with a 75-day discretionary appropriation bill? It will never work. This is like the dumbest thing in the world, even if it were going to make it work. And everybody agreed, but they went through with it anyway. And I got in a really nasty conversation with the then whip about this. Yelling, screaming, phone slamming. But it was but I held my ground. But I just remember that was so dumb. And it happened. But what can I say? It's just
We wish you were still there.
And we're going to get into the 2017 repeal replace in a minute too.
If I just may add to some of what was said in the implementation, because we are the legislative branch. They are the executive branch, which means, we're the first branch of government, Article 1, the legislative branch. But then Article 2 is the executive branch, which means they execute the law. And so it was really important. What we've been hearing from the 2 secretaries is very important, that they would stand in the way in the execution of the law. But remember this, because you talked about the opposition. When we first talked about this, say, beginning of February of 2009, brand new president, I said to the president, he wanted to do health care. We're going to do health care, but understand this. It's going to be carpet bombing, take no prisoners, you name any act of violence in war. That's what we're going to be facing, because the insurance company is never going to give up what they own out there. And they're anti-government people who don't want to see any public health initiative and that kind of thing. Oh, no, we're going to... No. So we knew what we're up against. And when we passed the bill, the day we walked from the Cannon Building to the Capitol with a gavel to take up the bill, John Lewis was right there. He and I held that gavel together as we walked over. He got spat upon. These people were screaming and yelling. In fact, my grandchildren saying, why are they saying something about Aunt Nancy, me, my daughter, because they were calling Nancy foul things about me. But it was awful. It was so awful. And John said, I've never been through anything like this since Selma. Since Selma. But, okay, so that's the atmospherics. In terms of legislation, what happened then, and the 2 secretaries can attest to this, is when President Obama now is president, we're in the minority. The Republicans would bring up, you said 70 bills to repeal it, but they would bring up little pieces like, see this piece of chocolate cake? This is really going to be good for you if you vote for this. And really it was doggy-doo, but the members didn't know. They just didn't know that. So I had people who had sacrificed their political career to vote for this. Then I had these newcomers who had come in, and they were fabulous and they were wonderful. But they were like, oh, that sounds like a good idea. It's popular in my district. I said, but you can't vote for it because we have to have enough vote to sustain President Obama's veto. So this is about President Obama. You're just new here. You're going to vote against the President of the United States of your own party because you don't even know what you're talking about? I said it nicer than that, slightly.
She did.
Slightly, but they got the point. But anyway, so they would say, well, I know my district better than you know my district. I said, well, I certainly hope so. But I know the Affordable Care Act better than you do and what it means to your district. So we had to hold these because there were a whole flock of them that are just going to vote for this doggy-doo singing its chocolate ice cream. And it would just totally undermine the bill. But it sounded good. So we had all that to deal with, too. The hardest thing I had to do as speaker or leader was to hold those people who weren't even there for the fight, they're new now, hold them under, shall we say, a lovely arrangement where they would not vote against the president by being attracted by some, shall we say, misrepresentation of the facts of what was in the bill. And that was not passing it, but holding it.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's pivot to Medicaid for a second, if we can.
Governor Cooper is here. He made it happen in North Carolina. Governor, are you still with
somewhere
us?
here.
We're going to be speaking with Kathleen. Where are you, Governor?
Back there.
Give us a wave.
Back there.
Oh, there he is.
There he
Roy
is.
Cooper. North
Governor
Carolina.
Cooper of North Carolina. Let's talk a little bit about Medicaid. Probably the biggest success of the ACA was the expansion of coverage, both through the exchanges and the subsidies, as well as the Medicaid expansion. Of course, at the time, a lot of people were concerned about Medicaid because providers for years complained about the reimbursement rates, and many providers were limiting access to Medicaid. But Medicaid, the politics has changed a lot. It's become much more popular over the years.
It's very popular.
Today than it was back in 2010 and even since 2017. So why don't we talk a little bit, Sylvia, about Medicaid? You see threats to it now with the reconciliation bill, obviously. Use it as a pay-for, perhaps. Why don't you can address this one, but still need to start.
In terms of maybe even starting with part of why the politics may have changed, and in the healthcare space, I think it's fair to say the substance is good. Good substance will translate to good politics if done and avoiding when something is misrepresented or that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But remember what the expansion did. The expansion created a world where people who are working, in terms of more and more people who were working but didn't, they made some income, they could still be on Medicaid. So you increased what the levels were, and so so many more people were able to come in. The other thing that I think is a change is the deep realization that Medicaid funds the vast majority of our nursing homes in this country. And what you did see with the Medicaid expansion is for many rural hospitals, while we've had hospitals close, Medicaid expansion is what made a huge, huge difference to the economics of those hospitals and therefore communities. Where we are now is a world where, so there was Medicaid and the work that everyone did to expand Medicaid. Kathleen, I think, will probably talk about some of the difficulties that occurred through the courts and other ways that meant all states were not expanding. But now we're at a place where we have the lowest uninsured rate in the nation, and it is Medicaid and the marketplace. Right now, what we're seeing, so we saw repeal, and we remember John McCain's vote and that sort of thing. If you look at the numbers in terms of the number of people that will be impacted in the current bills that are in front of us, the tax bill that is in front of us, and those numbers, you're getting very close. The scoring of the House bill would provide 16 million people would lose their health insurance. That's the CBO score. The Senate version has not been scored, and it is worse. The provisions will take out more. The numbers, so you get a sense of the numbers, it's 8 million people would be removed from Medicaid. 4 million people would be removed because of the lack of extension of the tax credit, the advanced premium tax credit. And 4 million people would lose their health insurance because of other provisions that increase. It's fascinating to me because they increase bureaucracy around the use of the marketplace, or they do things like limit the time period, or they make it more difficult if there's a special enrollment period. And that's when you have a transition that you can go into the marketplace. For example, you lose your job, you're making a job switch, you have a child, and you have to transition. Any of those kinds of things are for special enrollment periods. So we're in a situation right now where much of the progress that you articulated in terms of coverage is under very, very real threat. And I think the last thing I would just say is that's coverage for those people, but everyone in here who has employer-based insurance, your costs will go up.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody affiliated with a hospital or know on any hospital boards or anything like that, indigent care and prices will go up. And so this is about the coverage, but it's about the broader economics of healthcare. And remember, healthcare is 18% of the U.S. economy.
Well, I think Sylvia explained it well. So the Affordable Care Act is written as a continuum of care for the lowest income workers who did not have affordable coverage in their workplace. So part of that lowest income worker, it made sense just to expand Medicaid. Their families were on Medicaid, they qualified, so that became the most efficient way to bring people in. As your income went up a little bit and you still didn't have an employer helping to provide a shared coverage amount, those folks could qualify for the marketplace, and the premium tax credit paid the role that an employer would play. So the government, by tax credit, said to Charlie, who's now buying his own coverage because he's running his own coffee shop, you don't have to pay for 100%, you're going to pay a share of the coverage and the federal government will help. As your income went up further, you lost that benefit. So it kept the slice of Americans who were in the workplace without affordable workplace coverage to be covered. That was the whole goal. And as Sylvia had said, this bill that is currently pending, and the Senate is definitely worse than the House. We still don't know all of the grim numbers, but everything that we're told, it is going to get worse, uses the coverage for these lowest income working Americans. Getting rid of that becomes the pay for the biggest tax break to wealthy corporations that we've ever seen. So that is the pay for. And across the country, millions of people will lose coverage, but more than that, 40 states have now expanded Medicaid. This puts a huge hole in 40 state budgets across the country because the governors, and I'm sure Governor Cooper, as one who has expanded Medicaid in North Carolina, knows, if Congress passes this and this goes into law, the governor is then left with the choice of either trying to come up with 100% state funds to provide coverage for those group of North Carolinians who will lose their coverage, and that's almost impossible in any state in the country, or the governor gets to say to those people, you no longer have health insurance. And doctors don't get paid, hospitals don't get paid, they lose their preventive coverage, they are less productive in the workplace. I mean, it's a spiraling downhill event. So it is really going to blow up, once again, healthcare in this country from a point where we now have the lowest uninsured rate we have ever had in the country, and people with the security that they don't have to go bankrupt if they or their family members get sick.
If I just may, Congressman, the two things that our secretary said, Secretary Burwell said that a large amount of this money is for long-term care. My sister from Trinity,
Kathleen works.
she said it's for poor children and the rest, poor people. If it were just for poor children, that would be reason enough to have it. But that's not what it is. Much of the money that is spent in long-term care for seniors comes from Medicaid. Middle-income families have a benefit. This isn't just poor people. And I'll just close by saying, a lot of those people don't have health insurance because when they go to work for a franchised food place or something like that, or a retail place or something big, they say to them, you don't have health care here, go sign up for Medicaid. That's what they tell them. We're underwriting what the companies should be doing as part of their share for these workers. Go sign up for Medicaid. So this, and as I say, the closing of the rural hospitals and the rest, it's tragic. But so many people and so many businesses in America benefit from Medicaid. 72% in the polls. In California, the Republicans are over 60% in the polls because they see their families using it and needing it. And I think the Republicans are making a big mistake going after Medicaid, and we'll have to prove that.
Well, it's also about 100% of the disabled care.
Disabled, people with
And home
disabilities.
health care, all of that is Medicaid.
Thank
So
you,
when
thank
people
you.
understand the populations, I think they say, why in the world would we cut services like this?
Yeah.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Yeah,
for
by
that.
the way, the poll that the speaker just referenced, that was, I think, the Kaiser Family Foundation. About 7 in 10 adults are worried that a significant reduction in federal funding for Medicaid would lead to an increase in the share of uninsured children and adults in the U.S. And the numbers, too, among support for Medicaid are pretty similar between Democrats and Republicans
That's right.
and independents. So that has changed a lot. But I got to tell you a Medicaid story. When the repeal replace, 2017, Trump gets elected. So we're in March of 2017. And Governor Kasich called me one day. My wife and mother-in-law forced me to go to the Philadelphia Flower Show with them. And I was bored out of my mind. But nonetheless, so I get a call from him, and it was a wonderful distraction, calling me about the repeal replace and the block granting of Medicaid and how this is going to screw up the state of Ohio. And so we're talking for about an hour and a half, better than looking at the flowers. And then, so I've been summoned to the White House on Tuesday, this is on a Sunday, to go speak to Trump about this. And so I take a 10-page letter from 4 Republican governors, Kasich of Ohio, Snyder of Michigan, Sandoval of Nevada, and Hutchison of Arkansas, states that had expanded Medicaid. And I gave it to the president. I said, this is a letter from 4 Republican governors, why this block grant is not going to work. And please take a look at it. We'll take a look at it. And Pence says, well, I think we talked, he was unsure of himself, I think we talked to Sandoval, there's an amendment. And I think that makes it pretty good. And I said, well, I hadn't heard that. That's great. So meeting breaks up. That wasn't bad. And then, and so I call Kasich up. I say, John, Pence said that there's an amendment to this bill. I haven't seen it. I'll get right back to you. And 5 minutes later, I just spoke to Sandoval. That's all bullshit. He's yelling at me. There's nothing happened. So, okay, that was Tuesday. Thursday, I go back in. I told the president in the Tuesday meeting when I was going to vote against this repeal replace. He took it well. And then Thursday, it was a different story. He said, who's against the bill? And there were 17 of us in the room. I said, well, I'm against the bill. The first one, he said, well, why are you against the bill? I said, well, it's Thursday, and we discussed this on Tuesday. Nothing's really changed. So the Medicaid provisions are bad. You shouldn't be funding Planned Parenthood. There's a lot of stuff in here that's a problem. If this goes down, Charlie, it's your fault. I'm blaming you. My administration's over. You're going to destroy the Republican Party. It's all your fault. You're being very selfish. You're being very selfish. Taxes are done. And so we're going back and forth, and a little argument going on here. And it got nasty. Everybody goes around the room and says, they're all against the bill. And then I knew a few of them lied to him, but it's all right. It's politics. After it's all over, he says, you still a hard no? I said, I'm still a no. He goes off of me again. I wait about 10 seconds. I said, oh, come on, Mr. President. He said, I'm done talking to you. Tell him I don't want to hear it. Turns away, looks in the other direction. And then, the bottom line is, we ended up having to tank that bill. And I told him that this Medicaid thing is an enormous problem. They just didn't want to hear it. I said, this is not going to work. You can't block grant it to the states, cut the funding, and then tell them to fix it. It's not going to work. And in the end, of course, it all went down when McCain did that. So. Yeah. But that was a Medicaid story that I'll never forget, and that it was a big issue. I was hearing more from the governor of Ohio than my own governor about this issue, frankly. So with that, we got a lot of other stuff we can talk about here.
I wish you were still there.
Oh my gosh! I have the welts from that one though. But that was a nasty. That was a nasty meeting, but we had some fun. But
We're going to hear from the audience?
Yeah, let's take a couple questions from the audience. Let's do that now. Yes. Right here's a question.
Hi Nancy, it's Bonnie Lautenberg. I want to say hello. My late husband was Senator Frank Lautenberg. He was one of the 51 senators that helped you pass that bill, and he would have done anything for Nancy Pelosi because he loved her. He was so
It was great. It was great.
All these bills take so many years to get passed. We worked on the toxic chemical bill for 10 years, okay, bipartisan bill, and bipartisan toxic chemical bill, and Trump came in his first term, and the first thing he did was cancel the bill. People worked on this bill for 10 years, okay, and it's just painful and a crime what happens in Washington. Thank you for all you've done, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment. There's a question over here, too?
Thank you. I sense that there's
Mike.
I sense that there's growing consensus around the country that the ideal would be some sort of universal healthcare system along the lines of something like Medicare for all. Was that just never considered possible, a bridge too far back then? And do you ever see that it might be possible in the foreseeable future to go to a universal system?
Medicare for all, I
Okay.
think was the question.
The fact is that the Affordable Care Act is a better benefit than Medicare for all. Most people, Medicare for all is a great rallying cry when you're at a rally. But when you're legislating, you want to make sure you're doing what's right for the kitchen table needs of the American people. So that is a fight we've all had, all people turning out in people's districts. Medicare for all, you don't even know. Compare the bills, okay? Now, if you want to talk about single payer, that's different. Single payer is just how you pay for it. It's a procedural thing. But that's not what they were advocating. They're still advocating Medicare for all. Affordable Care Act, better benefits. Maybe I'll just sort of tell you what it did, and President Obama loved to talk about the fact that so many millions more people had access to health care, and that was important. But what's also important, there's 150 million families in America, just under that had pre-existing medical conditions, whatever it happened to be, whether it's disabilities, whatever it happened to be, and that changed for them. There are a long list of benefits that are in the bill that being a woman is no longer a pre-existing medical condition. It was before. Women were charged more. The list goes on and on. And I wish that everybody who's advocating for Medicare for all, it wasn't politically, no. It was just not as good a bill as the Affordable Care.
And another specific, in terms of what the speaker is talking about, is the funding of preventative care. Your mammograms, your vaccines for your children, there were so many parts that would be taken care of once you had your insurance that you didn't have to pay for. And so it was moving us on the trajectory of health, not just health care, preventative care, so we are a healthier population. The complexity of the bill, and that also moves towards more affordability. So those kinds of provisions were about quality and affordability. And so the complexity of the bill, when she said we had to have the list and they bit off all of it, that was so important to move forward on access, affordability, and quality.
And I would just say that I think, would it have been easier to wipe everything out and start again if we could have done that on a whiteboard? You started with health insurance in the 40s, you probably would have done health insurance differently. But since America had a system based on employer-based coverage, what I think President Obama learned from the Clinton experience was to tell people, to tell everybody, you're going to lose everything you have, and we're going to start with a whole new plan, was not a popular approach. Because most Americans had insurance. Most Americans, even though they wanted costs to come down, they might want coverage to be better, they liked the insurance they had. So the goal was to fill the gap as opposed to wipe it all out and start again. And I think it was attempting to make the marketplace look as much like employer-based coverage as possible, because that's what in every state in the country was wildly popular with a lot of employees. So I think filling the gap, making the benefits in the marketplace plans are actually based on the most popular small employment plan in every state in the country. And California's looks different than what Georgia has. And it was a regional difference. It was based on coverage in that state, and it was to bring people into the coverage that they were very familiar with and just didn't have because they didn't work for an employer that offered that coverage.
Chip, you have a question up front here.
Yes.
Microphone's coming down.
Madam Speaker, pardon my political naivete, but what is the logic for members in the southern states where there's so much poverty for voting their constituents out of medical insurance? What is that logic, or is that not ultimately political suicide?
I think that's a question for you.
It's his team.
No, but here's the thing. We have a whole thing going on right now because of the bill to make sure that the constituents know what's in the bill. It's not a big, beautiful bill. It's an ugly and terrible bill. And for them, not for people from San Francisco to call somebody down south, but for people in their districts, nothing is more eloquent, tell me if you agree, to a member of Congress than the voice of his or her own constituent. And so when your constituents are saying, I know what's in the bill, I know I'm going to lose my Medicaid, I know our rural hospital is going to close, and the list goes on. When the members hear that from their own constituents, it is very impressive. Now, why that doesn't make a difference in their vote? They seem to be more afraid of the president than they are of the power of the people in their own districts. That's good. But what we're hoping to do is to defeat the bill. It's only at 28% in the polls. But yet, there are people who, if a president speaks, people believe them. You know, that's our tendency as a country, you know. And they believe that, oh, it's going to be okay, but it isn't. And one of the things they say about the Affordable Care Act, you're going to be able to have no pre-existing condition barrier. Yeah, you can have no pre-existing barrier if you're a Rockefeller.
Of course.
Right? Be so expensive.
It will be so expensive
People
because
who,
you changed the pool.
yeah, healthier younger people
Go out of the pool.
won't be able to afford the coverage, so they'll drop out. And so every state will be running what amounts to basically a high-risk pool. So people with pre-existing conditions will be priced out or locked into a market, and everybody else will flee because they can't afford the coverage. They say, you know, if you made about $82,000 a year, if the premium tax credits go away, the enhanced tax credits, they go away, you make $82,000 a year, your premium, because you will no longer qualify for a tax credit, your premium will go up an average of $1,600 a year. Folks cannot afford, I mean, think of the people you know who are struggling to pay groceries and pay their rent and buy shoes for their kids. They won't be able to afford it. So if you're healthy and you can, you know,
You go without.
take your chances, you'll be out of the market in a heartbeat, and it'll just collapse.
It looks like we're coming to an end, so what I'd like to, can we take more questions? Or what do you-
Sure we can.
It's up to you.
Back of the room there, that gentleman.
One more, and then I have something I want to say about the budget.
My question is actually for Madam Speaker and the Congressman. Forgive my ignorance, but I don't recall that we would have such massive legislation, transformative legislation, having to be passed through reconciliation, and that now seems to be the model. Can we get beyond that model, and how are we ever going to get some sort of consensus in Washington to get things passed, not just one party at a time?
Well, you'll have to talk to the Senate about that because
It is the Senate.
the reason they moved to reconciliation rather than just is because with reconciliation you just
50
need
votes.
51 votes to pass the bill, not 60 votes. Now, it should be 60 votes is kind of, in my view, ridiculous because the fact is 60 votes gives majority rule to a minority of the states. We take an oath to protect and defend the Constitution, and this is part of the Constitution, that they have. California has 40 million people. We have 2 senators. Idaho has 1 million people, and they have 2 senators. That's the Constitution. But the 60 vote is over and above that. And so it makes it almost, it just gives so much power to many fewer people. And again, reconciliation is only used for a budget bill. People say to me, you passed the Affordable Care Act, why can't you pass an immigration bill? It's not a budget bill. It has to be a budget. I could make the argument that immigration is a budget bill, but it's not a budget bill according to the parliamentarian there. But here's the thing, and just in closing, and my colleagues, I invite whatever you want to say about this in a bipartisan or what way. This is about the budget. Everything is about the battle of the budget in Washington, D.C. And what the problem we had in the first term of, who's there now, and the second term is that using the budget, he wants to give tax breaks. The first bill he passed had 83% of the benefits going to the top 1%. And people bought that, oh, he's passing a tax bill. 83% to the top 1%, adding $2 trillion to the national debt. Oh, these fiscally responsible people. $2 trillion to the national, and not adding a job, except maybe for somebody he was interested in, but not in terms of job growth in our country. So this is shameful, and they all voted for it. Okay, now he's back again. He's going to add more than $2 trillion to the national debt. And he's saying I'm paying for it by cutting Medicaid. No, he's cutting Medicaid because they're anti-government. They weren't for Medicaid to begin with, Medicare to begin with, Social Security to begin with. So this isn't like a sacrifice for them in any way. So people have to understand this. The budget is so critically important. In addition to Medicaid in this bill, they're cutting a huge amount of money for SNAP, food for people, whether it's Meals on Wheels for seniors or food for poor children or whatever, school meals, all of that. Why? So they can give a tax break to the richest people in America. The richest people in America. And so this whole thing of fiscal responsibility is very important, and it's important to note, forgive me if this offends you, when President Clinton, we'll get back to where you started, was president, we had something called pay as you go. This was something that many of us insisted upon, pay as you go. You cannot add to the national debt. If you have an idea, are you going to offset the spending by something else, or are you going to raise taxes to pay for it? But it cannot increase the national debt. The Republicans agreed with that in the Clinton years, okay? So by the end of Clinton's term, he had 5 budgets that were either in surplus or even, but no additional to the past. $5.4 trillion on a path to reduce the national debt. The Republicans came in, immediately a tax cut, Bush tax cuts. I love the Bushes, I don't put them in the same category, but adding $5.4 trillion to the national debt, an $11 trillion swing, the biggest swing so far in the history then of our country. Now really what is important there is that again, we were on a path to reduce the national debt, and it didn't happen. So when they're coming in now saying, oh, we're fiscally responsible, we're cutting Medicaid, and we can't feed these kids because we got to be careful for what we're adding to the national debt. No, they're adding all of that money to the national debt. And what's so sad is they'll say, I can't do this until I cut the food program. Really? That's your value system? So this is, with all, no, this is a partisan difference in the Congress of the United States. It doesn't mean all Republicans go down that path. But if you say pay as you go, and this is what I want you to remember, pay as you go means pay as you go for any initiative you have, but you must pay as you go if you're giving tax breaks to people. That is an expense. So you have to pay for that. So the Republicans say, oh, pay as you go for food, but don't pay as you go if you're giving a tax break. And that's something that if we can come together on that, we could have a much easier time doing the right thing for the American people and reducing the national debt.
Yep.
And by the way, I just want to say one thing. Healthcare and housing. Housing is a healthcare issue, so you're going to see a big fight for affordable housing as we go forward.
Just on the reconciliation question that she asked about, I mean, I personally hated the reconciliation process. I mean, I think in many ways,
It's terrible.
it speaks to a failure of the Congress to be able to do things in a more bipartisan manner than they used to be able to do. And that's why each party uses that mechanism. Of course, it has to be on budget-related matters. It's not ideal, but it's a problem. And by the way, on the filibuster, when I was elected in 2004, and the Republicans had the majority, House, Senate, Republican president, and I remember Republican members in the Republican conference would stand up in the room and say, "We need to get rid of the filibuster. You know, those evil bastards over in the Senate, you know, they're useless, and they need to change the rules." And I was always worried because the guys who were making those noises were some of the most extreme members of the House. And I said, if we passed, and I always said, and they would send McConnell over to talk to us, to talk them off the ledge. And I said, hey, if you want to change the rules for the filibuster, guys, there's a way to do it. Go to your county courthouse, announce your candidacy, raise $50 million, get elected to the Senate, and vote to change the rules. If those senators ever came over to the House and told us how to change our rules, then that would be a human rights violation. You know, but we tell them every day. And the problem I had is that there would be some really wild stuff coming out of the House Republican caucus when I was there. And I thought, I want the filibuster because they could pass this stuff on a simple majority. Seriously, like the Democrats wanted to get rid of the filibuster during the Biden presidency in the Senate. And you don't hear them talk about it now because you've got a Republican majority. And they're not going to talk about it until they have a majority in the Senate. So there's something to think about on the filibuster. I guess we're a little over time. Anything else from the secretaries? Anything in closing?
Just on the issue, I think this last question brings to the fore that we're not in a place where, as a nation, we talk about the choices. Your budget, I was at OMB when we balanced those budgets, the only ballot, in the Clinton years,
Clinton,
and then I was the director when I came back before I went to HHS. And your budget is your reflection both of your values and your priorities. And we don't have a process that works to get us there, but just the basic math of all of this is that the entitlements are our healthcare, the healthcare spending. The entitlements are our healthcare spending, Medicare, Medicaid. The entitlements are SNAP. The entitlements are Social Security. And that's where all the money is. Those are the big numbers. And so this question of, it's a math problem. We have these commitments that we've made. There's the issue of how we get revenue, and that's called taxes. The discretionary spending, which we, I think, have seen what has happened or not happened in terms of cutting on the discretionary side. But the real ball game is that question. How do we want to think about taxation, and how do we want to think about those commitments? And those commitments are generally in the space of our health care as a nation. And so we're not willing to talk about it, and we're not willing to say, this is what the choices are about. And I'm not weighing in on, people have different points of view, but having the real deal conversation. I think the speaker said, what the party that she leads, their point of view on these issues. But we don't even have that debate, and that's not the debate that the American people actually see or hear. Mm-hmm. And so I think it was an important place to end.
Well, I would just say also that Speaker Pelosi talked about the mobilization that occurred around the Affordable Care Act, one of the last big pieces. I mean, so this year it's 60 years since Medicare and Medicaid were passed. We've had a 60th anniversary. We're 15 years from the Affordable Care Act. But that mobilization has to go on across the country right now. And to Roy's question earlier, people respond to their constituents. And whether or not they end up squeaking this bill through is still a question of a matter of days. But if they do, I think a number of them need to be replaced when we go forward in 2026, and people need to say that isn't why we sent you there, that isn't my views and my values, and it will require the people to mobilize once again and say our values are with healthcare for American people, for food for our kids, for, to move us forward. So I think the mobilization is a key part. Whatever goes on in Washington is critically important, but it so is influenced by the mobilization across this country. And so,
Well, making sure that you have the last word, I'll just follow up on the mobilization piece. In 2018, when we won the House, was president, we had 10,000 events around the country to protect the Affordable Care Act, because the then president said that Obamacare sucks. I mean, this is what he said, I'm just quoting him. And that was crude, but it was dangerous as well. We said, no, it doesn't suck, it cures. And this is what we're fighting for. So we had 10,000 events where people told their stories. My mother had breast cancer, my child had heart condition, whatever it was. They didn't talk about the provisions or the politics, they just talked about their personal stories. So we won. We won 40 seats, 31 of them in Trump districts. People said to me, weren't you lucky that health care became the main issue of the campaign? I said, no, we weren't lucky. We made our own luck. We went out there and did this mobilization. And it wasn't that we did it, it's that people did it. And they did it in their own terms, in their own language. The terminologies and stuff that people could relate to. So it is power to the people as this goes, is to make sure that whatever comes out at the end of the day, that the mobilization has had an impact on it. I just would like to thank Aspen Institute for bringing us together, 75 years of this kind of conversation. Thank you, Aspen Institute. And thank all of you.
Thank you to the audience. I have to just say one thing. You made me think of it when you said the current president said some pretty unkind things about the Affordable Care Act. I remember during 2017, 2018, he said, we're going to cover everybody, it's going to cost less, and it'll be beautiful. And I said, and I remember going to some of the leadership stuff. Now, can somebody translate that into policy for me? It ain't going to work. So with that, hey, thank you all.
Thank you all.